Her name is Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. She is Special Gender Envoy for the African Development Bank. I want to thank you for the time. As I was saying to you earlier, this is a conversation I've waited for a very long time, for a very important reason. I want to understand how a woman comes into an institution that's more than 50 years old, like I am, and tries to make it understand that empowering women is actually part of the mandate and success of this very successful bank, and that if it does, it will be able to even achieve more than it has done before.
Good evening, Godfrey. It's also good to be here with you.
Thank you.
And it is an overdue conversation, but fortunately not too long overdue.
Sure.
I'll only be in the 1 year in the bank on the 1st of September, so you haven't gone by
this
the
is our 1 year anniversary, so let's mark you over the past year you've been inside.
It is 1 year now that we
speak about it. Yes.
And as you correctly point out, the African Development Bank is turning 50 years old in November of this year. So it's also quite time, yes, as we prepare for the 50th anniversary. So what is going to make a difference? I think, firstly, we've got to take into account that there is the 10-year strategy of the bank that has been adopted. And I think with the adoption of the 10-year strategy, there was a very clear understanding that if we're talking about transformation of the African economy, if you want to talk about the tipping point for Africa, you've got to take into account, you've got to be inclusive, you've got to take into account women.
Absolutely. Before we go there, I want to find out what you found when you walked in a year ago. What did you find in the AfDB in terms of this institution and the way it looked at women?
It's an institution that was open to a recognition that
it
women
recognized its shortcoming.
Yes, because I think the appointment of a special envoy was also, in the words of Donald Kaberuka, the fact that you can't deal with, with a problem as though it's normal when you're in war times. And when there's a crisis, you appoint a special envoy. So this is what they did.
This is a crisis. They recognize it as
there's
such.
A crisis because they really want to leapfrog. So it's not as though nothing has been done. So within the bank itself, I mean, it's no secret that it's essentially a male-dominated culture. But within the senior leadership of the bank and across different levels, they are champions for this agenda. So you had people there, and it's about moving the culture, about a sense of, okay, we can come out now and be champions on this area because there is a special envoy. It gives it the impetus required.
So there was a base from which you started that was at the top level, but not infused within the whole organization. I want to move on and talk about what you have been doing in the past year.
Yes. I think just before I move off this point, I think we should also bear in mind that there was a gender division. So it's not as though work wasn't done, but there's been a lot of pushback because this development finance institution, the African Development Bank, which is ours, is no different from many of the other multilateral institutions where they're struggling with the issue.
That's true.
And I think you look at commercial banks,
same
you
thing.
tell me how many, if you look at the boardrooms, what does it look like?
So Maria Ramos is alone.
She's alone. And when I spoke to Maria before I came in here, Maria said to me, Geraldine, it's going to be tough. These guys may be a bit sophisticated about how they deal with issues, but they may make you feel very uncomfortable. So what's happened over the past year? We've got a gender strategy that's on the table. But what's more is we felt that we actually need to walk the talk. So you asked me in the beginning, or I think it's just before we started, how do you guarantee that money reaches women on the continent? That the girls and boys will understand that the African Development Bank is reflecting change. And to that end, we looked at operations. So we looked at the insides of the bank and we said we need to change the DNA. Now, when you change DNA in a commercial institution or in a development finance institution, you must go to where the money is. Where's the money? It's in operations. In the bank, the largest resource, or the two largest departments, one of which is infrastructure, private sector and regional integration. That's where the money is.
Right.
So it was looking at the operations of the bank and saying, how do we ensure that we engender all projects?
From the existing programs.
From the existing programs.
Okay.
And if you look at when our midterm report comes out, you'll see that 70% of all operations have been engendered.
Okay.
And I think that is a clear sign that there's a move. And very clearly, it's not a move that's happened over 1 year.
Yeah.
I'd want to recognize the many out there who struggled over the period.
Absolutely, over the years. 70% of all programs are engendered, as you put it.
Yes, they've looked, it's been looked through, viewed through a gender lens.
Right.
You know, so that's what's being done.
Okay.
We also say that we need to look at the country strategies. And in the country strategies, ensure that it takes into account the gender analysis.
Right.
Because you've pointed out, more than 50% of the population are women.
True.
That's where your girls are.
True.
We also talk about the fact that there are certain sectors that are what's considered sectors where non-traditional sectors for women. You talk about oil, you talk about gas, you talk about infrastructure, finance as well, but they are a bit more in finance, but engineering.
Yeah.
So it means that we also need to look at the education system.
Right.
And how many girls are in maths and sciences?
Yeah.
So, you know,
let's spend some time on that. Let's spend some time on that, because that's the key, isn't it? It's education. Unless you're able to get these girls to school and ensure that they stay in school and then go on into tertiary education, you're not going to make a difference, are you?
Let me tell you a story. Please. I was in Zambia last month, in the Kafue area. And you know, there's a big project called Nega Nega. It's about $100 million plus project, you know. And it's in essence a water project, you know, the green in focus, so the waters run gravitationally and so on from the Kafue River.
Yeah.
That's right, you know. That community is involved. There's something like, I think, 175 smallholder sugar farmers, so smallholder farmers.
Right.
They had gone into a public-private arrangement with Zambia Sugar that is buying up like 2,000 hectares worth of sugar once it starts. They're in phase 1 right now. But you know, out of those smallholder farmers, because this project, I mean, we really superimposed on what was there, only about 11% of the smallholder farmers are women. So, I mean, we didn't re-engineer it. It's what is the existing situation. When I went out and met with those farmers, you know, they spoke about the positives of the project, the difference it's going to make, because you have power, everything is happening. But the one thing at the end, the secretary of that project, the older woman, she stood up and said to me, you know, the real difference here is our girls will stay in school. So we deal with early marriage. So, you know, it talks about the issue, how do we keep the girls in school? And we know that there's early marriage. And that's a great deterrent. And for every girl that marries early,
absolutely,
cyclical situation.
Absolutely. As one economist said to me, if you look at the economic choices that women have, they have not been given the other side, because the only side that's presented is one that you're talking about now, where you get into early marriage. And if we make it an economic cost to be able to get that out of the way, we're going to make a huge difference. But how do you work across? Africa has got what? More than 2,000 tribes? We're talking about 56 territories, if you speak, because you have to talk about the Arab Democratic Republic, Somaliland, etc. And make sure that the progress that you're making in one is reflected in the progress that you're making across the whole continent.
You see, this is the big challenge that we're looking at looking at as well, because you know there are many pockets of excellence across the continent, and we're saying in 2014 we want to look at impact and scale. What is it that we need to do differently? And to this extent, in sitting with a small group of people, we looked strategically and we said, what do we do? 10% of women on the continent are 50 million women. How do we reach 50 million women? And then you do another cut and you say, okay, 90% of Africa's population, or is it between 70 and 90, are in 9 countries.
Yeah.
So it means we've got to target those countries. I mean, it's the big ones,
right.
you know.
Right.
You also say there's countries that have made significant progress.
Yes.
Rwanda,
yeah.
you know, 64% of women represented, you know, in parliament and so on. So how do we take this forward?
Yeah.
And maybe some of the areas to look at, amongst others, are agriculture, because you find the majority of women in agriculture. So if we want to make impact, it's around agriculture, but it's looking at the agricultural value chain.
Right.
And we're discussing that. And you know, the African Union has focused on agriculture this year.
Yes.
And they've got the CADEP program.
Yeah.
But we'd also say that CADEP has only achieved 10% of what it should. And I know the chair of the commission is quite impatient, and so we need to move further.
Yeah, I can understand
and faster on that.
Yeah.
So you know, it's
so you're
looking
taking
at
these specific sectors.
We're looking at sectors and saying what is the impact we can make. We're also looking at financial inclusion. So we're looking at the financial sector, and we're looking at financial inclusion for women in Africa.
Yeah.
And again, last month, the African Women Economic Summit that the African Development Bank co-hosted with New Faces, New Voices, I mean, partnered with New Faces, New Voices, hosted by the Zambian government.
Yes, I remember
We
that
had
conference.
a number of players around the table, and there we had women from equity, you know, women fund managers, we had women in microfinancing and all, but we said, let's see how we take this forward. So again, in this area, there are 2 large projects we're dealing with. And the one is to look at women fund managers and a women's fund. But secondly, the gauntlet was thrown down there that said, shouldn't we have a women's development fund? Shouldn't we look at something that's along the lines of an infrastructure fund, but that will target initiatives for women? Because generally, when there's investments, people say, okay, what's the collateral?
Absolutely.
And you spoke about tribes and so on, cultures and all that. And this also reflects on land, legal and property rights, inheritance laws and all. And we need to deal with these issues.
You are dealing with a minefield, aren't you? I'd like to talk to you about that aspect, in particular also just how you go about trying to make sure that you are not stepping on very tightly held cultural norms, traditions, while at the same time trying to make people understand that we have moved on. The world is no longer what it was, and we need to include our women as part of an economic force. In fact, for selfish reasons, we need to get the women working. But that's in the second half. We're talking to Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. She's the gender envoy of the African Development Bank. Thank you for staying with us here on Beyond Markets. We're speaking to Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, Special Gender Envoy of the African Development Bank. Geraldine, thanks. And I really like the way you spaced out our discussion in the first half with the real examples of some of the work that you're doing on the ground. But I think what I wanted to do at the start is to get a snapshot of just how far behind women are, because I've just realized you're a mine of stats on where women are and what will be required to ensure that we include them in economic development going forward. So let's just begin with that. Just how dire is the situation across the African continent? Paint a canvas for me if you can.
You know, I'm not going to be able to paint a full canvas, but I'll just bring out a few things.
Please.
I mean, when you look at financial inclusion, the figures are really not good. You know, you're talking about 15% of women who are, when we look at financial inclusion as a whole, and then when you unpack that, you also look at a country like South Africa. It's in the lead, and when you look at women's banking, it's also largely because of government policies. I mean, just think about it. The social grants in South Africa, there was a requirement at a point that you needed a bank account in order to access that grant, and automatically that pushed up the numbers, you know. We've also seen initiatives across the continent that shows women in microfinancing, and you've seen this commitment to bring the unbanked into banking. You then have a country like Kenya, where you also have the use of mobile banking, and I don't have the figures right now, but Kenya, the situation changes quite a bit, and it's a positive picture there. But then you can go to other places where women are completely unbanked,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And here we
Still
need
not
to
allowed
look
to
at,
have a bank account.
and they're not
Can't
allowed
do
to
anything
have a
without
bank
man.
account. They've got to have,
Yeah.
you know, the approval of a husband to
Yes.
open a bank account.
Yeah.
But you know what we've also found through the literature, that in certain instances, the legal environment may be in place for a woman to open an account. There may be the constraints, and this you have in Southern Africa, where you have to have the approval of your husband. And mind you, in South Africa, that was as recent as in the 90s, you know, mid-90s, where you needed your husband's approval to open a bank account as a married woman.
I remember it as well.
And you know that if you want women to really expand in entrepreneurship, and women are really predominant in that area, but as small entrepreneurs, they need to be able to do things without necessarily going for, you know, this approval. Because sometimes, you know, we don't always want the husbands to know, because they may not always use that responsibly.
We will come and take the resources and go and expend them on another woman.
Exactly, or on drinking and so on. I mean, as someone joked, and I think she wouldn't mind me quoting her, Daphne Daphne Nkosi said, you know, that when men really hit it big, then they take their mistresses for shopping in London. When women hit it big, I mean, you know, they spend it on education, they expand businesses and so on. But look, I'm not just beating up on the guys, because they are also gender sensitive guys. They are also male feminists. You know,
I am hoping you will include me in the gender sensitive guys.
But just coming back to the discussion you raised in the beginning, you said sketch a canvas, and I didn't do it
So we've done financial inclusion.
We also know, for example, that in agriculture, 70% of those who are on small holdings, women who are using a hoe and so on, are the ones who contribute towards food security. But we need them to move. I mean, you don't just want the big road that the bank builds between two countries, whether it's you know, Cameroon and I think it's Nigeria or something. You know, I think there's a particular highway. We don't only want them to sell along the side of the road. We also want to ensure that from planting the seed right up to the markets, they're involved in trade. You know, so we need to ensure that the value chain is in place.
Included as well.
And again, when you look at the percentages of women, they may be there on the little patches, but they don't move into the business and up the value chain. We don't see them in agribusiness. And again, the African Development Bank has got involved in a number of initiatives. There we have the Agriculture Fast Track Fund that we've funded.
Open to women alone?
No, it's women and men, but also targeting women. And we're working in 7 countries on that at the moment. It will be expanded beyond that. But we're still looking at that big initiative that's going to be the tipping point. How do we reach the 50 million across, you know, the women on the banks of Lake Tanganyika, the women in the far north of this country of ours. How do we reach them?
Okay, so that's on the agriculture side. That fund, I'm hoping people can apply to, so they can go to the AfDB website and they can apply it for funds in the countries where it's operational, and it will be expanded to the other countries. What about the other big area? We spoke briefly about it earlier, education, which to my mind is probably where most of the resources ought to go, which is not to forget that, of course, we've got a current situation where women need to be included.
You know, on education, we are working on that, and particularly in the area of science and technology. And this is through our human development department. And in October, there's going to be a meeting of ministers of finance as well as ministers of education to look at this area, because we feel that we need to do a lot more.
Right.
We know the number of PhDs are dismal. We've spoken about engineers, etc., and there's a major problem around that. But it's not in our core business. So we work with other partners on
with
this.
the national governments.
With national governments, with the regional member countries. We've, because we have developed recently a skills strategy. It's identified education and science and technology as a critical area. We also look at the need to, look closely at the tertiary institutions on the continent as well, and look at how we can improve the capacities of these, because Africa really needs a huge turnaround on this. I know that CNBC had a panel, I think it may have been earlier this week or last week, that looked at these areas, and I know Precious Motsepe was on that panel and various others.
Absolutely.
And they spoke about the importance of education, and I think we cannot overstate the need to take this forward, because again, you educate a girl, you educate a community.
For sure.
And in many instances people claim, but I was challenged by a young man at the annual meeting of the bank in Rwanda when I said, you educate a man, you educate a man. And this young man stood up and said, I'm Rwandan. Look at what we're doing in this country. We're very conscious about the need
But that's the other challenge, isn't it? That you're also working on, how to ensure that as we empower women, we also at the same time pull our young men with us, because we don't want to create angry young men who veer to the other extreme and view women as opponents instead of actually collaborators and partners in growing our continent.
But that's why I'm special envoy on gender.
Right.
Not
for women.
And gender also looks at men, it looks at girls and boys, because in essence we look at policy, we look at programs, implementation, and we say, are they appropriately skewed to take forward an agenda that we all talk about on this continent? We talk about inclusive growth. Is it really inclusive?
No.
Do we take into account both sexes as we take forward as we implement our policies, as we introduce programs? And in this process, I mean, we also need to look, you spoke about ethnicity, spoke about tribe. It's about men and women. It's about the reality. When you challenged me and you said to me, aren't you treading, you didn't use these terms, but you suggested I may be treading on corns. Because what one is putting on the table, there may be resistance.
In the name of modernity, absolutely.
But it's not even about modernity. Let's just talk about a few things. Firstly, we've always said culture and tradition is dynamic.
True.
It's not static. It's not,
it is
stuck in a particular time frame. Besides that, if we just look at the founding fathers of Africa, let's go back to the Julius Nyerere and others. And if you look at the OAU, I mean, it spoke about the equality of peoples. And peoples were surely men and women. You go to the AEU Charter, you go to the AU, you look at the Human Rights Charter and all that. Africa is very clear when it comes to its founding documents, when it comes to protocols about what it should be, but it's about walking.
And we have not been walking the talk. We've got 3 minutes left, and I want two things quickly before we let you go. One is the 10-year strategy and how it relates to gender development. And then finally, your final thoughts on the impact that Ebola has had on women across the African continent. Sometimes we mask these things inside the big numbers, but we forget to go into the detail and find out what's actually happening to real people on the ground. So let's begin the 10-year strategy first.
Okay, I've got 3 minutes, so I'll make it cryptic. With the 10-year strategy on gender, it's declared it as the area of special emphasis, which means it has to be cross-cutting across the bank's policies and programs, and this is what we're trying to do. And fortunately, as I said earlier this year, the board adopted the gender strategy that has 3 pillars. The pillars are legal empowerment, legal status and property rights of women, It's the whole issue of women's economic empowerment and looking at the whole area of knowledge production. So that's about, and the gender strategy takes forward the 10-year strategy.
Right.
What we need to do is make it real.
Right.
Let it translate into the projects and the rands and cents, and this
Right.
is what we're doing within. Second issue.
I'm going to have to call you to come and talk about that strategy and the exact pillars and the detail inside it.
I will definitely come back.
Thank you.
Now, on Ebola.
Yeah.
I was with President Donald Kaberuka in Liberia and Sierra Leone last week.
Yeah.
We were there on Tuesday and Wednesday. It was a 24-hour trip.
Right.
And going in there, it was actually to say to the world, don't isolate countries, isolate Ebola.
Right.
Because as Kaberuka said, that if this isolation continues, you're going to see a drop of GDP. And last week he said of at least 1% for countries. It's looking worse, 3 to 5%, because of the travel restrictions that the World Health Organization does not call for. But what's even worse.
So you were there last week?
I was there last week.
Okay, so you demonstrate for us how you go about greeting people before we end the show.
Yeah, we'll do that. and just how we should do it. And the fact that doctors have told us over years, use hand sanitizers, you avoid flus going on.
Absolutely.
Now we need to do that.
Sure.
But the second issue is the most affected people are health workers and women. And let me again give you numbers. You know, the worst scenarios in Liberia, 70% of people who died are women.
Wow.
And what we are saying is, how do we stop talking about the statistics and seeing this as an issue to discuss and actually do something about it?
Right.
And for us, as the ADB, we're saying our intervention is going to be supporting women now, during this process and post-Ebola, because we need to look at how we assist them with economic engagement and ensure that all won't be lost. We also look at psychosocial support as required.
Right.
We assist women as well as children who have been affected by this. And I can talk a lot more, but
Absolutely.
I think another
we've
time.
run out of time. But you've actually put funds aside for this.
Yes, as the bank has been one of the first respondents, and we committed $60 million to this. And the first tranche was paid out yesterday to the World Health Organization. And in the payment of that tranche, that money goes for the remuneration of health workers. It's going to health facilities and infrastructure. And to hospital beds.
Absolutely. Our time has run out, but I must demonstrate what you showed me when you greet someone who's come from West Africa.
No, we must greet everyone.
Without isolating
the countries.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We isolate the disease.
Absolutely, we're isolating the disease.